With Diane, I have a couple of instances, mainly the one when we all met for the first time. I don't know if you remember it. It was in East Harlem, and it was at a restaurant called Patsy's with the intimate cast of The Godfather.
They started as co-stars, then friends, but Hollywood changed them both. When pressure mounted against Diane Keaton, even Al Pacino stayed quiet. Years later, his words hint at guilt, admiration, and truth. Was he protecting her, or finally admitting how Hollywood turned them against each other? The Godfather Wars, how Diane Keaton's independence clashed with Hollywood power. When Al Pacino stood before the American Film Institute to honor Diane Keaton, his tone carried something more than admiration. It carried remembrance, nostalgia, and an unspoken acknowledgement of how Diane had defied an industry that rarely forgives nonconformity. Those were simple words, yet within them lay the essence of how Keaton had always existed on the margins of Hollywood tradition, playful, eccentric, and immune to pretension. When Pacino recounted their first meeting, it wasn't on a soundstage or at a casting call. It was at a small Italian restaurant in East Harlem called Patsy's, with the intimate cast of The Godfather.
It was in East Harlem, and it was at a restaurant called Patsy's with the intimate cast of The Godfather.
There, surrounded by titans like Marlon Brando, Al Pacino watched as Keaton broke an invisible Hollywood rule. She didn't defer to power.
And he said, "Hi, Diane. I'm Marlon Brando." And she looked up, shook his hand, and said, "Yeah, right, okay, good, that's fine, okay, you're right."
In that one moment, she demonstrated what would define her entire career, a refusal to perform reverence, even for legends. It was a small act of defiance that quietly unsettled the hierarchy that defined Hollywood's golden circle. Diane Keaton entered The Godfather as an outsider, both professionally and temperamentally. The industry around her was controlled by male executives, many of whom viewed actresses as accessories to the charisma of male leads. Keaton, however, had an uncanny ability to command space without dominating it, to draw attention without seeking it. But behind the scenes of The Godfather, there was turmoil. Studio executives at Paramount were deeply skeptical of Al Pacino's casting, dismissing him as too inexperienced, too quiet, too unorthodox for the part. Diane later recalled on The Graham Norton Show how the studio wanted to fire Pacino and they wanted him out.
I remember he was talking about how they wanted to fire Pacino and they wanted him out.
But Francis Ford Coppola refused, going as far as shooting the pivotal restaurant scene where Michael Corleone kills the cop to prove Pacino's brilliance. That scene saved Pacino's career and solidified his legacy. But in Hollywood's calculus, Keaton's support for him, both publicly and privately, positioned her as unpredictable, even dangerous. She was loyal not to studio executives, but to art, to authenticity, to people she believed in. That independence, while celebrated by Pacino, was a red flag to an industry that thrived on obedience. The tension between Diane Keaton and Hollywood wasn't overt hostility. It was quiet resistance. She didn't rebel loudly. She simply ignored expectations. Her early interviews revealed a woman uninterested in the Hollywood social circuit. While other actresses sought to blend glamour with diplomacy, Keaton wore men's blazers, spoke with unfiltered honesty, and resisted sexual objectification long before it became fashionable to do so. Critics at the time misread this as eccentricity or arrogance. Studio insiders whispered that she was difficult and aloof, but what they truly meant was that she didn't play by the rules. When Pacino later said during his AFI speech, it wasn't merely advice, it was a reflection of how both of them understood the hypocrisy of Hollywood. In an industry that worships artists publicly but punishes them privately for being unmanageable, Keaton was warning Pacino, "Don't give them an excuse to see you as self-important." Ironically, she herself would later be branded with that same label, an artist too pure for the machinery she worked within. During the making of The Godfather, Diane Keaton's performance as Kay Adams, the outsider who watches the Corleone family from the periphery, mirrored her own position in Hollywood. She was part of it, but never of it. Her portrayal captured emotional restraint in a way few actresses dared to at the time. Instead of embodying the submissive, decorative archetype, Keaton played Kay as conflicted, morally grounded, and unwilling to surrender her identity to power. Many critics overlooked how radical that was. Hollywood in the 1970s still preferred women to embody devotion rather than doubt. By humanizing Kay instead of romanticizing her, Keaton challenged that formula. She gave audiences a woman capable of moral clarity, and in doing so, she disturbed an industry invested in keeping women decorative rather than dimensional. Behind the camera, Keaton's unconventionality became a topic of fascination and frustration. She was was known for showing up on set without makeup, improvising dialogue, and questioning directorial notes. While Coppola appreciated her spontaneity, studio executives interpreted it as non-compliance. To them, actresses who thought critically were liabilities. Keaton's refusal to conform made her a quiet symbol of creative rebellion. Even her wardrobe, both on-screen and off, became statements of identity. In an era when glamour meant vulnerability, she chose anonymity. Her later collaboration with Woody Allen in Annie Hall would turn that aesthetic into cultural currency. But at the time, Hollywood dismissed it as unmarketable. The irony was striking. The same qualities that would later make her iconic were the very ones that made her suspect in the beginning. Part of the animosity toward Keaton stemmed from envy. She was not merely an actress. She was a thinker, a photographer, and later a director. Her intelligence, often wrapped in self-deprecating humor, intimidated people who were used to actresses competing for approval. She didn't chase validation, and that unnerved an ecosystem built on flattery. When The Godfather became a phenomenon, Keaton didn't capitalize on it the way others did. She withdrew, avoided self-promotion, and focused on working selectively. This decision puzzled many in Hollywood, where momentum is sacred. Insiders began labeling her as difficult to manage, a coded phrase used to describe women who made choices outside the studio's agenda. Keaton's attitude toward fame was another quiet act of rebellion. While her contemporaries cultivated mythic public images, she spoke openly about her insecurities and refused to idealize herself. In interviews, she often shifted credit to her collaborators, particularly Pacino, Brando, and Coppola, but that humility only made her harder to categorize. Was she naive or subversive? Was her humility genuine, or was it a shield against a system she didn't trust? The ambiguity made her fascinating and threatening. When she praised Coppola's genius for protecting Pacino's role, her reverence for him contrasted sharply with her indifference toward Hollywood's bureaucrats. To executives, that loyalty to a director over the studio line reinforced the perception that Keaton belonged to the artistic camp, the dangerous camp that valued integrity over profit. Her resistance wasn't rooted in arrogance, but in self-awareness. She understood that Hollywood's adoration is conditional, offered freely but withdrawn quickly when one stops playing the game. That's why her portrayal of Kay Adams resonates even more in retrospect. It was a self-portrait in disguise, a woman surrounded by power but quietly rejecting its corruption. Breaking Hollywood's rules, the Diane Keaton persona that challenged the industry. By the time Diane Keaton transitioned from The Godfather to Annie Hall, she had already created something Hollywood didn't know how to market: authenticity. Keaton's transformation from the quiet observer of the Corleone saga to the quirky, androgynous lead of Woody Allen's universe marked the beginning of a creative paradox. The same industry that once distrusted her independence now wanted to commodify it, but Keaton never made it easy. She didn't perform individuality, she embodied it. The contradiction was too much for Hollywood's hierarchy. The film world praised her brilliance, yet behind closed doors, the same insiders whispered that she was too strange, too intellectual, and, in private circles, too uncontrollable. To an industry built on image and compliance, Keaton's unpredictability was both an asset and a liability. Hollywood's discomfort with Keaton wasn't born out of scandal. It came from her refusal to be defined. She had entered an era where actresses were expected to serve as extensions of male directors' visions, yet she navigated her roles with a degree of authorship that unnerved the system. Annie Hall's loose improvisational tone reflected Keaton's natural rhythm. The film's dialogue, wardrobe, and even her awkward silences were extensions of her real personality. The androgynous fashion that became her signature, wide ties, slouchy vests, and men's trousers, wasn't a costume choice suggested by stylists, it was hers. When the film's costume designer Ralph Lauren was credited for inventing the Annie Hall look, Keaton later clarified that those were her own clothes. Her rebellion wasn't against femininity, but against being told what femininity should look like. That self-direction made her an icon to audiences and a problem for traditionalists. She wasn't shaped by Hollywood, she was shaping it, and that inversion of power created resentment. During the 1970s and 1980s, Hollywood was dominated by archetypes: the ingenue, the seductress, the muse. Keaton was none of them. Her characters were witty but anxious, confident yet self-effacing, romantic but not submissive. For producers and casting agents, this duality was unnerving because it blurred the binary roles women were confined to. Her screen presence was a contradiction. She could play vulnerable without appearing weak and humorous without playing dumb. That subtle power irritated executives who were used to controlling female narratives. When Keaton began choosing roles based on substance rather than profile, she was accused of being elitist, yet she was simply exercising agency in a system that wasn't designed to allow it. The envy surrounding Diane Keaton within Hollywood circles was a quiet, persistent current. She was successful without being scandalous, adored without pandering, respected by male peers without appearing dependent on them. Her relationships with powerful figures like Woody Allen and Warren Beatty graffiti fueled gossip, but Keaton's refusal to exploit them for publicity only deepened her mystique. She never used personal narratives as leverage. She let her work speak instead. Insiders began labeling her as aloof, even arrogant, a term frequently used for women who maintain boundaries in male-dominated spaces. Keaton's distance wasn't detachment, it was defense. In a town where intimacy is often transactional, she kept her emotional life private. That privacy reads as rebellion. Diane Keaton's sense of humor was another form of subversion. Instead of cultivating the image of the mysterious screen siren, she mocked herself, turning insecurity into identity. Her self-deprecating wit disarmed audiences, but confused an industry that preferred self-importance. In interviews, when asked about her romantic life, she often deflected with humor rather than confession, refusing to feed tabloids. That restraint gave her power. While others relied on exposure for relevance, Keaton's refusal to overshare made her simultaneously enigmatic and uncontrollable. Publicists couldn't predict her. She'd show up to award shows wearing gloves and hats that looked decades out of fashion, smiling mischievously as cameras scrambled to categorize her style. What they didn't realize was that Keaton had long understood something most of Hollywood hadn't. Mystery is the ultimate form of power. In private, her defiance of convention extended beyond fashion and film. Keaton became one of the few actresses of her generation to openly discuss aging without apology. While many of her peers submitted to Hollywood's beauty standards, she rejected invasive transformations, choosing instead to embrace the natural progression of her features. Her candor about aging was radical in an industry obsessed with youth. She once remarked that she didn't want to look frozen in time, an implicit jab at the artificial perfection that defined celebrity culture. By aging on her own terms, Keaton was defying Hollywood's oldest taboo, visible maturity. She was proving that longevity could exist without conformity, that charisma didn't depend on erasing evidence of time, but such authenticity came at a cost. As the industry shifted toward commercialization, Keaton's artistic integrity began to isolate her. Studio executives found her unpredictable, directors found her intimidating, and younger actresses saw her as unreachable. Behind the curtain, there was an unspoken narrative. Diane Keaton wasn't one of them. She didn't network the way others didn't attend the right parties, didn't court influence through flattery. In an environment where access equals opportunity, Keaton's detachment meant exclusion. Hollywood began rewarding visibility over craft, and Keaton's quiet approach, her refusal to self-promote aggressively, made her seem like a relic of a more honest era. Her political and social views, though not extreme, were often expressed in ways that clashed with Hollywood's performative activism. Keaton's advocacy for personal freedom and individuality was rooted in self-determination, not ideology. She rarely joined collective movements or used her platform for slogans, which earned her both respect and criticism. To some, her silence was dignity. To others, it was non-conformity. In truth, Keaton's reluctance to align with Hollywood's groupthink made her an outsider in an era where conformity was disguised as progress. She never followed trends, not in style, not in speech, and not in moral signaling. Her friendship with Al Pacino remained one of the few constants that survived Hollywood's shifting alliances. Pacino, himself known for his solitude and selectiveness, seemed to understand her detachment. Their mutual respect was rooted in shared resistance. Two artists bound by a refusal to compromise their inner worlds. Pacino's continued defense of Keaton throughout his career wasn't just affection, it was recognition. He understood that her ostracization by certain circles wasn't because she had wronged anyone, but because she refused to belong to anyone. Hollywood, however, punishes independence disguised as indifference. Keaton's authenticity was a mirror that made others uncomfortable. It reminded them of what they had sacrificed to remain acceptable. The tension between Keaton and Hollywood became more visible as her peers began transitioning into roles defined by their public image. Keaton, meanwhile, kept reinventing herself. She directed films, explored photography, and published memoirs that were introspective rather than sensational. Critics praised her creativity, but insiders often described her as too serious. The irony was glaring. An actress once dismissed as eccentric was now being criticized for depth. That inconsistency revealed Hollywood's double standard. Women could be quirky or glamorous, but never both intelligent and in control. Keaton's ability to oscillate between humor and intellect defied categorization, and categorization is what Hollywood thrives on. Keaton's evolution wasn't just artistic, it was existential. While others sought legacy through awards and accolades, she pursued meaning through creation. Every project she touched, whether acting, writing, or directing, reflected a singular theme: autonomy. She wasn't chasing fame, she was documenting curiosity. Yet in an industry where even authenticity is eventually commodified, her refusal to commercialize herself made her seem alien. Hollywood didn't hate Diane Keaton because she failed. It resented her because she succeeded without obedience. She thrived without the approval of those who believed approval was the only path to success. Her choice to remain unmarried was another quiet rebellion that unsettled traditionalists. In a system where actresses were often defined by the men they married or the families they built, Keaton redefined completeness. She adopted children later in life on her her own terms, without apology or spectacle. This decision, deeply personal and unconventional, further cemented her image as a woman who lived by her own script. To an industry obsessed with narrative control, that autonomy was intolerable. She was rewriting the rules of femininity in Hollywood, not through theory, but through action. Keaton's continued influence, even as she distanced herself from Hollywood's social machinery, revealed an unspoken truth about the industry. It fears women who no longer need it. Her refusal to be commodified turned her into a paradoxical symbol, both revered and resented. Her colleagues spoke of her brilliance with admiration, tinged with discomfort. She had mastered the balance between visibility and invisibility, between fame and distance. That balance was power. And in Hollywood, where power is often confused with exposure, Diane Keaton's invisibility became her most subversive act. The price of authenticity. Why Al Pacino still defends her when Hollywood doesn't. When Al Pacino stood before the American Film Institute to honor Diane Keaton, his words carried a weight deeper than nostalgia.
You're an artist, Di. You're a great artist.
That declaration wasn't just a tribute, it was a defense. It was Pacino's way of reclaiming Keaton from an industry that had long failed to understand her. Hollywood has always celebrated its icons posthumously, in absence or retrospect, but Keaton was still there, hat tilted, smile mischievous, still refusing to conform. The industry had tried for decades to categorize her, to decide whether she was eccentric or brilliant, difficult or disciplined. Pacino's speech made that decision irrelevant. To him, she was an artist in the truest sense, not because she followed the rules of art, but because she ignored the rules of commerce. And in Hollywood, that distinction is everything. Diane Keaton's later career was a study in contradictions. She became both a household name and a ghost within the system that once built her. By the 1990s and 2000s, she was part of Hollywood's collective memory, but not its current machinery. Directors still called her, but not for blockbusters. Studios wanted her image, the charming, offbeat older woman, not her intellect. The transition from leading lady to supporting presence was both natural and symbolic. Hollywood was acknowledging her value while quietly sidelining her influence. Yet Keaton didn't resist this evolution. She leaned into it with grace and humor, reinventing herself once again. What others might have seen as decline, she treated as liberation. Without the pressure to conform to youth or glamour, she could finally act on her own terms. But even in reinvention, Keaton continued to unsettle the establishment. Her later films, Something's Gotta Give, Morning Glory, Book Club, reframed older womanhood as vibrant, witty, and complex. She dismantled the Hollywood myth that aging actresses should fade into irrelevance. In Something's Gotta Give, her performance opposite Jack Nicholson turned vulnerability into authority, sensuality into maturity. Critics hailed it as a breakthrough for representation, but Hollywood's internal culture saw it as a challenge. The idea that an older woman could carry a romantic comedy and outshine her male counterpart threatened the industry's age hierarchy. Keaton wasn't just acting, she was rewriting the rules of cinematic desire. Off-screen, Keaton's power continued to manifest in subtler ways. She became a producer, a director, a photographer, and an author. Her memoirs, including Then Again and Brother and Sister, were praised for their candor and introspection, not for sensationalism. They revealed a mind more interested in reflection than revelation, a rare trait in a celebrity memoir culture addicted to confession. Keaton's books didn't expose, they explored. Yet, her restraint fueled the same discomfort that had followed her for decades. Hollywood, ever suspicious of self-contained women, interpreted her privacy as secrecy. In truth, Keaton was one of the few stars who had learned to preserve herself in an industry that thrives on consumption. The conspiracy around Diane Keaton, if one could call it that, isn't a story of sabotage. It's the story of how Hollywood resents what it can't control. The same independence that made her magnetic in Annie Hall and Reds became the reason studios stopped trusting her. She didn't play politics, didn't network strategically, didn't trade personal vulnerability for professional leverage. In a town where careers are built on alliances, Keaton built hers on solitude. Her refusal to bend to the culture of performance, whether political, aesthetic, or social, made her both timeless and untouchable. Hollywood loves authenticity only when it can sell it. Keaton's authenticity, however, could not be packaged. It was unpredictable, self-directed, and unprofitable in its purity. Her friendship with Al Pacino, lasting through decades of artistic evolution, remained a constant reminder of that purity. Theirs was not a partnership built on spectacle, but on shared understanding. They came from the same generation of method actors who valued interiority over fame, but Keaton's path was lonelier. Pacino had the luxury of being celebrated as a genius despite his reclusiveness. Keaton's solitude was interpreted as eccentricity. This double standard standard reflected Hollywood's deeper bias. The same traits that make men mysterious often make women difficult. When Pacino praised her artistry, he wasn't just being sentimental. He was making a quiet correction to decades of misinterpretation. He was acknowledging that her rebellion wasn't carelessness, it was courage. Keaton's influence extended beyond her own filmography. Her impact on fashion, character writing, and representation is visible in every generation of actresses who defy conventional glamour. From Greta Gerwig to Emma Stone, her imprint can be seen in the balance between awkwardness and confidence that defines modern screen heroines. Yet, Hollywood's selective memory often erases the pioneers of change once they stop conforming. While male auteurs are celebrated for aging into legends, women like Keaton are quietly categorized as relics. The irony is that Keaton never stopped working. The industry simply stopped recognizing her as central. In interviews, she addressed this invisibility with humor, not bitterness. That composure, that refusal to become a victim, may be her most radical act of all. Her career's second act, defined by independent projects and personal creative ventures, reveals another layer of tension between Keaton and the Hollywood system. She began directing films like Heaven and Unstrung Heroes, projects that were too introspective for the mainstream but deeply respected by critics. These works explored mortality, family, and identity, themes rarely given to women filmmakers at the time. Keaton's direction was understated but precise, her aesthetic marked by empathy and curiosity. Yet instead of being celebrated as a filmmaker, she was still primarily labeled as the actress from Annie Hall. That reduction, subtle but persistent, underscores how Hollywood contains its women, allowing them to expand, but only within familiar boundaries. The industry's ambivalence toward Keaton was compounded by her resistance to reinvention for reinvention's sake. While others rebranded themselves to remain relevant, she allowed her contradictions to remain intact. She didn't repackage her eccentricity into a marketable quirk. She didn't chase youth through cosmetic transformation or trend alignment. This constancy was a quiet challenge to Hollywood's entire ecosystem, proof that longevity doesn't require compliance. Her continued relevance was proof of concept that the system itself was flawed. It wasn't that audiences rejected complexity, but that studios underestimated them. Even in the era of social media, where celebrity visibility is constant, Keaton remains elusive. She participates online, posting humorous clips, architectural curiosities, and affectionate tributes, yet never performs desperation. Her social presence feels accidental, a continuation of her lifelong detachment from the spectacle of fame. While others curate digital personas to preserve relevance, Keaton's posts reinforce her difference. She's still the same figure she was when she met Brando and shrugged off his introduction, amused, grounded, uninterested in hierarchy. In a way, that moment has echoed through her entire life, a quiet refusal to worship power, no matter how iconic it appears. Hollywood's discomfort with Diane Keaton isn't a matter of personality, it's structural. The industry thrives on predictability, and Keaton has always been ungovernable. She doesn't fit into archetypes, she creates them. She doesn't echo trends, she precedes them. The same qualities that earned her admiration from peers earned her distance from executives. She's the anomaly who makes conformity look obsolete. For decades, this contradiction has fueled whispers that Keaton is difficult, eccentric, untamable. But when analyzed through the lens of gender and power, these accusations reveal less about her and more about Hollywood's unease with women who command space on their own terms. The supposed hatred Hollywood held toward her wasn't emotional, it was institutional. It was the quiet, procedural marginalization that happens when someone stops needing permission. She was never exiled. She simply stopped being invited to play by the old rules. Yet, despite being underestimated by her own industry, Keaton's legacy continued to grow organically through influence rather than promotion. Her image, the slouching hat, the oversized coat, the wry smile, became shorthand for authenticity. She didn't need to assert rebellion. She embodied it by existing unapologetically. Her continued influence outside the mainstream proves that true icons don't require institutional endorsement. In an industry built on illusion, Diane Keaton's reality became revolutionary. Her legacy is not a product of branding or marketing, but of authenticity, sustained over decades. Hollywood may have marginalized her for it, but it could never erase her. Every generation that celebrates individuality, every actress who wears a suit on a red carpet, every film that embraces awkwardness as beauty is, knowingly or not, echoing Keaton's defiance. Thanks for watching. Check out other cards on the screen.